Hi, I'm Michelle Laws, Chief Experience Officer for the North Carolina Medical Society. Thank you for tuning in to our new podcast, Public Rounds. Public Rounds is intended to keep the public informed and abreast of timely, relevant, and important health-related topics. And I could not be more thrilled to kick this podcast off than to have one of my favorite North Carolina Medical Society members and docs, Dr. Kerianne Crockett. Many of you may have heard of her back in 2019 when she was instrumental in getting a bill passed, House Bill 608, protecting and restoring the dignity of women incarcerated in North Carolina prisons. I'm going to let her share some of the details about that, but thank you, Dr. Crockett, for being our guest today. And thank you so much, and thanks to your boys and your husband for lending you to us today as well. Dr. Crockett, some of you may not know, is a native of North Carolina. She's actually from Charlotte, and she has been practicing here at ECU since 2012?
2012.
2012. So I want to jump right in. Tell us a little bit about House Bill 608, which is now law, and how it came about and the significance of it.
So, and also I want to clarify that the bill existed long before I got involved. It was kind of bouncing around in various forms, but it didn't gain any traction in the legislature. But there are a lot of groups that have worked really hard on it before I got involved. When I was still unaware, not really formally involved in the advocacy world, when I took care of a patient here at our hospital from one of the county jails, and I'll spare some of the harder parts of the story, some of the details, but in summary, she was brought in labor. She was cuffed at the ankles and the wrists through the whole thing. She had a devastating outcome. Getting the cuffs or the shackles removed was a really big ordeal. I'm sure that the trauma and the sequela of that, well, I know that it has stayed with her for a long time, and it also stayed with me. So in the days, months, weeks after, I tried to figure out whether what I'd seen was kind of a one-off, a deviation from policy, or whether this was kind of within the standard expected thing for people who are pregnant, especially in labor, in the carceral system. And I learned a lot about the difference between jails and the North Carolina prison system and kind of the jurisdiction over each of them, and blah, blah, blah. Fast forward, was also involved in the North Carolina Medical Societies, which is I was also involved in the North Carolina OBGYN Society's leadership committee, and so I brought the issue up. I shared my patient's story with the other members of the executive committee and our lobbyist, and over time, kind of came around to maybe if we share my patient's story with some key legislators, talk to the Sheriff's Association, talk to whoever, maybe we can start to make some headway on this bill that exists that would protect future patients against being shackled during their pregnancies. Mm-hmm. So we went with some key legislators, and then I actually reached out to every sheriff in the state. And let me back up and say that this was all with the patient's permission. Mm-hmm. Once I decided that I wanted to kind of take the story public without sharing her identity, I got her permission to do so since it was such a specific story. And so shared her story with all the sheriffs in the state and said, what would this legislation look like in your jail, and what can happen? And there were a lot of other really important players in the advocacy space. There were a lot of other organizations involved. Mm-hmm. One thing led to another, and it ultimately passed both houses of the legislature unanimously. Yep. It was introduced in April of 2021 and eventually passed both houses, and then was signed into law in September and went into effect in December of 2021.
And that's, oftentimes when we think about women's health and maternal health, that's just one story, one sad story that ended well, that has, for other women, a happy ending, although not for your patient. This podcast is kicking off during Women's History Month, and the North Carolina Medical Journal, their issue this month, or for March, focuses on maternal health outcomes. And we know in North Carolina, as across the nation, minority women, ethnic minority women, and particularly Black women, tend to have worse outcomes in terms of maternal health. Talk to us a little bit about maternal health in North Carolina, the state of maternal health outcomes in North Carolina, and what some of the factors may be contributing to the worst outcomes for Black women.
There are huge disparities in outcomes across the country, and especially in the southern states and especially in rural areas of the country, and there are big racial disparities. The outcomes overall, maternal mortality and maternal severe morbidity is too high in this country. For an industrialized country with all the resources we have, it is too high. And then when you look closer and see the disparity between white patients and non-white patients, you have to think why. Mm-hmm. I think it's multifactorial. I think that it has to do with implicit bias and racism in the medical system, in individual providers. I think it has to do with environmental factors. I think it has to do with socioeconomic inequity. There's so much, and there's a lot of really smart people and really thoughtful people trying to dig into it and parse it out and try to mitigate the impacts of all of those components. But yeah, it's inexcusable.
Dr. Crockett, so speaking of taking care of yourself, when should mommies or when should girls and their parents start pursuing reproductive health care?
That's a great question. There's not a defined age. It's not like you have to start going to the OBGYN when you start your period or have to start at 16. I think it's a combination of how comfortable does the patient's pediatrician feel with addressing reproductive health or menstrual or sexual health questions. That's probably a factor that goes into it. I think making sure that everyone knows that coming to the OBGYN doesn't have to mean a pelvic exam. A lot of adolescents are understandably wary about coming in because they're afraid of a pelvic exam. Pap testing or cervical cancer screening doesn't need to start for most people until age 21. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of ways to test for STDs without doing a pelvic exam. My personal bias is that earlier is better because OBGYNs are pretty universally comfortable talking about period, sexual health, sexuality, birth control methods, all of those things. And so I think that the earlier and the more we can normalize that stuff for young women or people that identify differently in terms of gender orientation but have uteruses.
Yeah.
The more and earlier that we can do that, the better.
So, Dr. Crockett, a lot has been going on in the reproductive health space. What do you think about what's been happening?
I think reproductive health care decisions are incredibly complex a lot of the time, and anything that limits access to reproductive care has the potential for patient harm. Anything that confuses or complicates or restricts the patient-doctor relationship has the potential for harm.
So, Dr. Crockett, access to care is extremely important to the North Carolina Medical Society members, specialty societies, and yet, though, we are seeing a disturbing trend in North Carolina, especially in rural North Carolina, with the closure of OBGYN clinics. Talk about what's going on there. What do we need to fix that?
We want to do anything that increases the ability that people will be able to get to care. And getting to care or access to care is a multifactorial thing. It's one, the ability to afford care, so having insurance and having the ability to actually afford to go to the doctor. It's also transportation and distance required to travel to get to the doctor, especially when, transportation may be a limiting factor or a barrier for patients. And so it breaks my heart that so many rural centers or rural obstetric care centers and providers have had to close. And all of those things just make it harder for patients to get the care they need.
So, Dr. Crockett, I want to, first of all, thank you so much for being our first guest on Public Rounds. It's quite an honor. We've got to get you back. And I want to end this podcast giving people some hope and some joy. So, what brings you or gives you joy?
This probably sounds cliche, but truly, I derive a lot of satisfaction from my job. I love my job. Sometimes, don't get me wrong, I feel overwhelmed by and exhausted by my job, but I really do. I've wanted to be a doctor my whole life, and so I do love my job. And also, I love spending time at home with my family, my husband, and our two boys. We have an almost 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and so any time that we get carved out, just the four of us, is really fun.
Awesome. What about your favorite books or book that was transformative for you?
I think I have two. First is Complications by Atul Gawande. It was the first sort of like medical memoir genre book that I ever read before I went to medical school, and that catapulted me into the world of medical memoirs. And there's so many really good ones. I don't want to leave anything out, but everything by Atul Gawande is so inspiring and so informative. And then in the fiction world, I really like historical fiction. And there's a book called Cutting for Stone by Abraham Varghese, I think, or Varghese. And without giving too much away, it focuses on, well, it has a little bit of OBGYN themes brought into it. It also focuses on the Ethiopian-Eritrean War. And I learned so much from it, and it has one of the best endings that I've ever read. It's not a happy ending per se, but it's such a satisfying ending, and it's an incredible book.
Well, I'm going to go and download my Kindle, both of them. Thank you, Dr. Crockett. It has been a pleasure. And thank you all for tuning in to Public Rounds. Remember, anything you want to find out or know about the North Carolina Medical Society, you can go to our website at ncmedsoc.org. That's ncmedsoc.org. And remember to follow us on all of our social media channels. Thanks. We'll see you next time.